off the back of the stage. Oh my God, it is bright. Wow. I guess that's for C-SPAN. Okay, is C-SPAN audio okay? Can you hear me? Good. Okay, thanks for coming out. I used to live here, of course, so this is an extremely familiar bookstore to me. I used to haunt it when I was younger, that time so long ago. And I cherish this particular store, and I thank you for supporting it. We just lost the last significant bookstore in North Berkeley where I live, and to not have a bookstore really changes things. It's extraordinary. You know, I'd like to believe the net makes up for it, but it doesn't. It's just not the same. So these are really precious places. So this book. Pardon me. The other thing about pollen, I remember, is that I'm allergic to it this time of year. These extraordinary wafts of pollen that come over from the ocean borne by our fog. Okay. 30 years ago or so, 30 and some odd years ago, I was part of a circle of young techies, and I bet there are other people from that circle who are here who were just on fire with this idea about how we were going to improve the world. We were going to get digital networking to happen. We were going to get amazing user interface experiences to happen. We were going to make computing easy and accessible to everybody, and it was going to create this huge wave of well-being. I remember anticipating this so tangibly that I could feel it. I could just feel, wow, we're going to do a wonderful, wonderful thing for the world. And I still believe that we will, and we have a little bit. But in my view, in my experience, something started to go wrong and has gone really pretty bad. So I want to explain what that is so you can understand my motivation and how I came to the position I have now. When huge new waves of technological efficiency have appeared in the past, they've often been imperfect. They've often created little power centers or disruptions or all sorts of things. But generally, the appearance of the interstate highways, of plumbing, of electricity in the wall, of nitrogen-fixing fertilizers, vaccines, clean water available with the turn of a knob in your home. When all these things appear, what is undeniable and really apparent immediately thereafter is a wave of improvement and well-being for people. Vast portions of the population start doing better. All kinds of things are opened up. I was certain that was going to happen with digital networking, but it's not exactly the way things went. Starting around the turn of the century, I started to notice a pattern that was really bothering me, which is that my friends who worked in the industries that were most affected by digital networking first, and I'm thinking of musicians and journalists and photographers, were not finding the world of new opportunity that I had for so long anticipated would appear. Instead, I ended up almost every week having to be part of a fundraiser to help somebody get a crucial operation they needed when they didn't have insurance or something like that. And I'm talking about people who are well known and, you know, not the unknown, not the unfamous, but these are well-known musicians who, were ashamed to admit that they needed help. And that had not been true before. That was new. But then what really hit me was the financial crises. The whole developed world, and I'm focusing here on the developed world exclusively for the moment. I'll get to the developing world later. But the whole developed world, at approximately the same time, got itself tangled up in financial absurdity. You had the most powerful countries losing their credit ratings. You had loss of social mobility, jobless recoveries, hollowed out job markets, insanely tight credit, massive waves of financial fraud or pseudo-fraud. And most of all, there was a phenomenon of intense concentration of wealth and influence and a loss of the broader middle of wealth and influence, a decline of what we could call the middle class. And this happened in societies all over the world, not just here, all the developed ones. And this just blew my mind. Now, when I looked at this, I noticed something that sent chills down my spine, which is that all of the newly powerful elite, all of the people who are really at the center of the game, and I have to mention, I've done pretty well in this game myself, so I'm not talking about some remote other, I'm talking about me and my friends, and I know many of the individuals who've done really well in the last 15 years, let's say. These are my buddies, they're not some weird aliens. But every single one of us who's done well is somehow close to one of the biggest computers on the net. And what I started to realize is that in the new system we've created, power and influence were accumulating around the biggest computers on the network. This happened in finance, it happened in insurance, it happened in electoral politics, it happened in media, it happened with nation states. It was happening all over. So I thought back on my idealism from when I'd been younger. I'd been kind of a fire-breathing, open culture person for years. I helped make up a lot of the rhetoric. And what we had always believed is that if you made information available as an ambient resource, it would create so many opportunities and so much efficiency and so much creativity that we weren't sure what would happen, but surely the incredible sprouting of benefits from that would overwhelm any problems that would otherwise be temporary. But we failed to consider something, which is if you want to create this utopia where you have all these people sharing their information and everything's available, people might be created equal, but computers are not created equal. Computers are vastly different from one another. Some computers are giant server farms in Utah collecting information for American intelligence organizations. Some computers are giant server farms powered by their own power plants and cooled by rivers or even glaciers. There are all these exotic ways to try to deal with these giant things we have to build. Some of them belong to financial schemes, some of them belong to social media or search companies, some of them belong to financiers. There are all kinds of different ones. Some of the weird distributed ones that take over our computers are run by criminal organizations, but they're all basically doing the same thing. So what happens is if everybody shares equally, whoever has the best computer gets unnatural advantages, gets advantages that are so profound that they seduce the owners of the largest computers into, well, let's say when you're gifted, when you're privileged, you often don't notice it. It's a thing that's invisible. It's a form of failure that sneaks into people, and you end up essentially taking advantage of your position without ever intending to, without ever knowing, because it's the most natural thing in the world. One way to explain what it's like to have the biggest computer on a network is to go back to a thought experiment creature from the 19th century. You're going to notice that I'm going to go to the 19th century a lot in this talk because I feel the 21st century is in a way an echo of the 19th century in a multitude of ways. So there's a creature I'd like to introduce you to. Actually, in a town like this that's so educated, most of you will probably know about this, but I'm going to talk about Maxwell's demon. How many of you have encountered this demon? Ah, okay. Well, you never know. So Maxwell's demon is somebody who you will meet if you take a class in introductory thermodynamics. Oh no, he's going to talk about physics. Run! No, it's really simple. James Clerk Maxwell had this demon named after him. Imagine a little demon who's opening and closing a little tiny door. It's just an itty-bitty door. It's just big enough for a molecule to slip through. The demon is watching molecules in two chambers that are right next to each other, and this little door connects the chambers. Each chamber is filled with a fluid, water or air, something like that. And the demon is watching the molecules approach the door, and if there's a really hot one on the left side, the demon will let it through to the right side, and if there's a really cold one moving around nice and slow and smooth, the demon will let it go to the left side. And just by observing these molecules and opening this door very carefully, the demon separates the hot from the cold. Once you've done that, you can do something rather nice, which is you can open up a bigger door and let the cold and the hot mix again, running a turbine on the way, and then you can repeat the process and you have perpetual motion, right? Global warming solved. Okay, now perpetual motion machines don't work, and the reason is really interesting. The act of discrimination, the act of dealing in information is real work. It's never purely abstract. It's never separated from reality. So the act of opening and closing that little door and of observing those molecules in itself takes more power and generates more waste heat than you attempt to save by running the turbine in between sessions, right? So this is also known as no free lunch, and you can never get ahead of the game. Every purported perpetual motion machine turns out to be a Maxwell's demon fallacy if you understand it well enough. Okay? Now, what's happened with big computers is that the owners of big computers, without even meaning to, without any bad intent, pretend that they can be Maxwell's demon, but in economics instead of in thermodynamics. Okay, so here's how it works. The most familiar example is probably American health insurance, right? That most cherished of American institutions. Health insurance used to try to calculate risks, and there were professionals called actuaries, and they had to write down figures and tables. They had to work with very poor information, very roughly gathered, and in a crude sense, they would try to set the rates of policies. Their job wasn't really to exclude people by surprise, however. That only became possible when there was so much data and so much computational power to work with the data that you could start to pretend to be Maxwell's demon. So you gather statistical correlations to predict who's going to need insurance, and then you open the little door and you say the people unlikely to need insurance gather over here and they'll be insured, and the people likely to need the benefits of insurance, we put them on the other side of the door. And thereby, by having the biggest computer, we create the perfect investment. We create the perfect scheme that can't fail because we're only insuring people who need it, and we know for sure we'll make a great profit. There's a story I perhaps shouldn't tell, so I'll tell it without naming the specific people. This was in the book originally, and the editor's lawyers cut it. But there's a little island that's used by the Republican establishment and some large corporations for planning retreats, and I won't say where the island is. And I had a consulting gig helping the largest American insurance concern figure out how to operate their big computers when they first got them. And I remember the CEO of this concern talking about how, well, we'd really love to not insure people who are going to turn out to need insurance, and we should be able to avoid doing that, you know. And at that moment, there was this weird rushing sound, like, and then there was this enormous, and it was like a little earthquake. And it turns out there was a meteor strike right next to us. And so, anyway, those of you who are astronomers interested in meteors, who are seeking a device to attract meteors in order to be able to study them, should really look to the population of health insurance executives, and you will find what you need. So the metaphor I'm making between Maxwell's demon and the so-called perfect insurance scheme that you can get with a giant computer should be clear by now. You operate this little door and you think you're creating the perfect business that's all benefit and no risk. But the problem is you're radiating this heat, you're radiating the risk out to the world, and the world isn't infinitely large. It can't absorb all the risk. It can't absorb all the people who need insurance. And so eventually the system breaks and you undermine the system in which your own wealth even made sense. So it's ultimately self-destructive, but in the immediate sense, it's more destructive to others. So in a short-term sense, you can say, well, others are hurt more than it by me, but ultimately everyone is hurt, even the people who are trying to run the perfect investment. Now, this has happened to health insurance in America, which we can see just by looking at the state of our country, but it's also happened in finance again and again and again. So some friends of mine who were quants used to work at an outfit called Long-Term Capital. Remember that one? So Long-Term Capital was an attempt to use big computing to make the perfect investment fund. And it seemed too good to be true, so in order to create an air of legitimacy, they hired a bunch of people who had Nobel Prizes in economics to be associated with it. And it looked perfect at first, and when it failed big, and guess who paid for it? Hello, all of you. You paid for it. And there was another one called Enron. And Enron was doing exactly the same thing. Great big computer. Let's make a perfect investment because we can predict where the risk is and make sure other people have the risk. I remember getting a call from Enron. They wanted to buy my little startup. And I thought, no. We don't want to sell our little pretty startup that we love so much to some company that's just trying to take advantage of big computing. No. Guess who bought it? Google. So, and I'm sure I love Google still. I'm sure there's some Google people here tonight. You guys are great, but we'll get to that. We'll get to Google. Then the thing about it is that even though Maxwell's demon illusions always break after a while, the temptation is so great because at least in the first phase, it does work. If you have the biggest computer in a connected network, you can calculate little tiny ways to improve your game so that other people take the risk and you get the benefits, and everything seems golden, everything seems perfect. But what happened to finance and what happened to insurance will happen to Silicon Valley if we keep on doing things the way we're doing them, and it'll happen to every other area of life that we try to organize this way. And this is the fundamental pattern that we have to figure out a way to transcend. It's not going to be easy because it's seductive. I've been on the other side of it. It's great when it works. So it's like heroin or something. It's information heroin, and we have to find some way to get off it. Now, I mentioned that I will be returning to the 19th century again and again, and so I will return to it now. In the 19th century, a lot of things happened. There was a whole 100 years there. There was a civil war here, lots of new technology, lots of new science. But in terms of human thought, there was a unifying theme that was so powerful and so present that the expressions of it remain dominant today. And the theme was robot anxiety. The 19th century was defined intellectually to an amazing degree by a fear that people would be made obsolete by improving technology. You might not think of that as being a 19th century concern. You might think of it as being a more contemporary one. But let me give you a couple of the signposts of that century. First of all, the Luddite riots, which were riots by textile workers being concerned that they would be made obsolete by improved textile machinery, by improved looms. That was a very ugly early battle that resulted in public executions and whatnot. That, in turn, strongly influenced the 19th century's thinkers, and I'll mention in particular Karl Marx. If you read the early Marx, like the 1840s Marx, he was really at that time a technology writer concerned precisely with this issue. And I realized that once, as I describe in the book, I was driving, I think on Alma, and I was listening to KPFA, but I didn't know it was KPFA. I thought it was KQED or something. And there was somebody going on and on about how they were going to lower barriers to market access, and they were going to, capital was going to flow, and there's going to be all this stuff. And I thought, oh God, it's another one of these stupid Silicon Valley startups. I just cannot listen to another one of these raps. But it was actually a reading of Marx. And it was the strangest thing, because I realized, oh my God, like the guy, and I went back and reread it. And there, if you forget about his, I'm not a Marxist. I think his proposed solution has been proven to fail. But if you read his descriptive work on what was going on with human life in a world of improving technology, wow, he sounds contemporary. It really is extraordinary stuff. There aren't that many songs from the 19th century that are immediately familiar to us, but the Ballad of John Henry is one. And it's about a guy who's in a race with a robot that lays railroad tracks and manages to win, but dies from exhaustion. So it was this sort of tragic, ironic bid for sympathy of people in a race against machines. The literature of the 19th century is with us today, and we call it science fiction. The earliest science fiction was directly motivated by a fear of human obsolescence. A wonderful example is H.G. Wells' Time Machine, where humanity splits in the future into two species, one of which it benefits from being, I don't know, it's like the descendants of those who own Facebook and Instagram and Google. They're sort of the rich ones who run the scheme, and then they farm and eat the other ones who are the hoi polloi. But the interesting thing in Wells's vision is that both sides of that divide, both species, are made kind of ridiculous and absurd by their situation. But if you look at science fiction, occasionally it's an alien who makes us obsolete, but it's one or the other. It's always a question of whether humans will become obsolete or not. And usually it's our own machines that make us obsolete. And that continues to this day with the Terminator movies and the Matrix movies and on and on. That's the theme over and over again. So science fiction and Marxism both started out of robot anxiety in the 19th century. So a very interesting thing happened in the 20th century. In the 20th century, we didn't see massive waves of unemployment because of improving technology. And of course, the reason was that new jobs were created when machines got better. And it turns out those jobs were usually more desirable. They were usually safer and cleaner and easier and more dignified and more intellectual and all that. But it didn't happen automatically. There was this little thing called the labor movement. And the labor movement was no small thing. It was a gigantic, bloody, difficult movement. And the labor movement, in a sense, was fighting for the right to get paid even if your job isn't as miserable and as dangerous as old jobs. That's something that's often forgotten. So let's imagine for a moment that this bookstore is located in Rochester, New York, instead of Menlo Park, California. And if we were in Rochester, we would remember that in the 19th century, it was the center of the manufacture of buggy whips. And then the buggy whip went obsolete because motorized vehicles came along. Now, I love horses, but dealing with horses as a necessity just to get around is really a pain in the butt. I don't know if you've done it, but there's the feeding, there's the poop, there's the hoofs, there's the getting kicked, there's the fact that not all of them are that nice, and you get the whole thing is really a big nuisance. And so having a motorized vehicle is not only cool, but it's so fun. You'd wonder why people wouldn't just pay to drive them instead of being paid to drive them. And so, if you ever wonder why is the Teamsters Union kind of a tough union, it's because it had to be tough to assert that even though all you're doing is sitting there putting your foot on a pedal and steering a wheel, you still deserve to get paid. That's why cabbies get paid. And every time that you see a job that isn't utterly miserable and dangerous but still pays, you'll notice something about that job, which is that there was in the past some struggle that created some sort of little ratchet or structure that helps those people get paid despite the fact that they're not constantly risking death. There's either a taxi medallion or a union membership or tenure for academics or something. There's always some kind of a little mechanism. And this is the reason why in the 20th century we got better jobs to go with better technology. It wasn't so much a question of whether people were still needed or not. It was a judgment, hard-fought win for the judgment that even if the new roles for people were more pleasant than the old roles, you could still get paid for them. That's what happened in the 20th century. So unemployment crisis averted, middle class strong, especially in the post-war years. Now, at the turn of the 21st century, we suddenly decided to renege on that covenant. We suddenly decided, you know what, screw that solution. We'll just let people go obsolete. Now, let me explain how I see this happening. One of the magical little tools that are available for us, seemingly for free, is language translation, approximate language translation. So you can upload an essay in English and get it back seemingly automatically turned into a Spanish essay that's not perfect, but is readable. And Google does it, Microsoft does it, and there's a few others that do it. The first company to demonstrate it was actually IBM's labs, but it's a pretty common thing at this point. So the way we talk about a service like this most commonly is as if there's a giant artificial brain and we're privileged to get the services of this artificial brain for free, right? Isn't it a wonderful world in which you can benefit from this artificial brain that can translate between languages for free? Now, there had been a time when there was a hope that this brain might be created. It goes back to the 1950s when some of the pioneers of AI weren't really sure what would be involved. And just on a lark, Marvin Minsky told me this. He was one of my mentors when I was very young, one of the founders of the AI field. Marvin assigned some grad students a summer project for seeing if they could write the little parser to translate between languages. A smart mathematician might just be able to come up with a formula, right? Now, that doesn't work. It famously doesn't work. What does work is what we call big data or giant corpora, or whatever terminology you prefer. What happens is we gather up large numbers of examples of real translations done by real people. Then we pattern match those against your new example to find little points of coincidence, and then we mash up bits of old translations into a sequence to form a new translation. And lo and behold, that's not so bad. That's how it works. That's how the game works. So the thing is, it's not a magic artificial brain. It's a mashup of real people who we pretend don't exist. Okay? So what we're saying is, as this technology progresses and gets better and better, if you're a translator, if you're multilingual, that job of translating is not like being a truck driver or being a cab driver. Even though it's not miserable, this time you don't get paid for it because we've anonymized you. We've pretended you don't exist to create the illusion of a giant electronic brain. Okay, so this is yet another example of what I call a siren server or a Maxwell's demon, where we're creating this illusion that all the value goes to one side. We're going to let all the value from the translation go to one side, but all the people who actually did the work go over to the other side. And we're going to try to make the perfect scheme where we own this electronic brain. So when big data is involved, when you hear the words artificial intelligence or something like that, or even the word automatic, what you should hear is instead the words accounting fraud. What's actually going on is that the real people who did the work are being forgotten. They're being hidden behind a curtain. There's an act of magic, a stage magic that's gone on, not real magic. So what's crucial about this is that as long as we keep thinking this way, if we decide to renege on the covenant that allowed employment to continue, even when the misery of many jobs was reduced in the 20th century, if we renege on that covenant, the 21st century will see the realization of the anxieties of the 19th century, that people will be made obsolete by our machines. There's absolutely no need that this happen. It's not based on reality. It's based on a judgment about how we're willing to acknowledge each other. So what I'm hoping you can see here is that there's a connection between the kinds of roles that people can get paid for and this tendency of whoever owns the biggest computer to naturally benefit from the possibility of trying to calculate a perfect scheme for themselves. They're two sides of the same coin. Every time you happen to find yourself with one of the biggest computers and you use it to improve your situation, the way it works is that you're gathering data from people, and the key is that you don't have to pay for the data. If you had to pay for the data, if there was actually a market in it, then it would be more like raw materials and you'd have to pay more for more valuable information, that sort of thing. It's the fact that the information is free that creates the illusion that you can be Maxwell's demon, but information is never free. That's what we learn in basic thermodynamics. Okay, now, we're in a cultural situation right now where in order for me to talk about these things, I have to speak against the people I like the most. And this is awkward because right now, if you're on the side of the angels, if you're a good person, of course, you're supposed to love open culture and open information and all this. I've been really struck that open source code has become sort of the MSG of our culture, in the sense that you can take any really boring thing and just say, oh, but there's open source software, and then it's like hip. used underwear is being collected in Poughkeepsie, and it sounds like I don't want to click on this. I don't want to know about that story. Please, I'll read about yellow teeth, fine, anything, so I don't have to read about that. But then, if it says, oh, open source software is being used to sort used underwear in Poughkeepsie, then it's like, oh, hey, wow, that sounds really innovative. I wonder if that'll help global warming, or so, I don't know. It's like so the thing is, I'm in this position of having to speak against the thing that so many people are sure will help, and it's not comfortable. And I myself have helped make the thing up. I believed it would be true for so long. I don't think the open source people are the biggest problem right now, but they do create this kind of hipness or legitimacy to a problem that's mostly exploited by entirely different people. So right now, the form of free information and disenfranchisement that goes with it that people experience on a day-to-day basis is the kind brought to them by Silicon Valley, where, and once again, oh God, it's not comfortable to talk about this, but you get the free online course, but you kind of know in the back of your mind that your prospects for getting a job as a professor someday have just gone down, and that those two things go together. And it's not, and that doesn't mean the course isn't wonderful, and it doesn't mean that broader access to education isn't necessary and wonderful. But the particular way we're doing it does kind of undo our long-term prospects in exchange for short-term benefit. And you might say, oh, but all that new information out there, surely all those trained people, it'll turn around. Well, that's what I thought about networking. As long as the benefits are routed through computers, which they will be, then whoever owns the biggest computer will gather all the benefit and try to radiate the risk and the cost out to everyone else. In the book, I go through many examples of this. I talk about a hypothetical artificial gland that you'll be able to insert inside your tattoo, like a little clipped accent, that will synthesize chemicals for your body, and about how that could create a wave of health and well-being, but at the same time put doctors and pharmacists and chemists and all these people out of work, depending on how it's done, because it could be done in such a way that all the real work for people that makes it possible gets demonetized and unacknowledged in the name of sharing, while whoever runs the routing computer becomes infinitely wealthy. There's just no boundary to it. The greatest and the fastest fortunes in the history of the world are being concentrated around the biggest computers. That's certainly not what we had intended. So, you might ask, how do we get out of this? What do we do instead? I mentioned that the way people experience this as Silicon Valley companies, but the way it's hit hardest so far is the financial world. The world of high-frequency trades, the world of weird leveraged, bundled, derivative, hedgy things. There's actually whole other classes of financial schemes that run on big computers that aren't that familiar. There are these fantastic logistical schemes that use big computers to move money around at precise moments so as to avoid paying tax anywhere and to earn interest everywhere at once. These kinds of things are very commonplace and gigantic at this point. There's an absurdity to them that's invisible to the people who do them. Like I have a bunch of buddies who worked out the math for high-frequency trades, and it's cool. I mean, it's really fun. I could almost see doing it just because it's such a neat toy, And the thing about a high-frequency trading machine is that it's making trades so fast that there isn't time from the real world for information from the real world to get in. So it's technically impossible for these things to be optimizing based on events in reality. So then there's this other argument. Well, they're optimizing the function of the math of the market itself. And then that, I actually think it can be legitimate, but only if there's only one monopolistic high-frequency trade. Because if there's a multiplicity of high-frequency trading machines, what they do is they read their own algorithms. They create resonance between each other. So the little fluctuations they're detecting are just created by each other, so then they collectively milk money out of the world, radiating risk to everybody. Do you follow? And you'll find this again and again, where there'll be a little local framework in which what you're doing when you own a big computer seems to make sense, but if you look at the bigger picture, it never does, because there's never a free lunch. I can go over many examples of this, because they're fascinating variations. So, how do we get out of this? Okay, one way to get out of it is to say, you know what, this is it. We can't keep a market going anymore. We need some kind of other way to organize human affairs. We need to just give everybody a stipend when the machines get good, or we just need to not use money and we need to have some perfected political process and finally get socialism. I've gone down all those roads, and I don't think they go to pretty places. There are those who disagree with me. I have a lot of kinds of critics of the new book. One kind of critic is the person who says, why are you trying to keep markets at all? Why don't you just get rid of money at some point? And I think the problem with that is that politics also screws over people if it's allowed to function on its own terms. I think what happens with politics is that the same kinds of power and influence concentrations that we see in certain kinds of unbridled capitalism occur just in a purely political way. We see communist parties seize power, or mullahs, or whatever it is, again and again and again. People are difficult creatures. I don't know how many of you, I remember being a young hippie and trying again and again to live in a group household, and just finding it to be terribly, terribly difficult. A number of these group households are right down the road here in Palo Alto, and it's very hard to make politics between people really work. And the reason it's always been hard is not because there was a lack of an internet, but because people are just ornery. Like the horses I was mentioning before, we're just difficult creatures. So I tend to believe that a purely political solution is just not going to happen. I think people are sort of perverse and difficult and all over the place. I think the use of markets, the use of money, should be understood as something that balances the tendencies of human society to become dysfunctional. Money also can be terrible. Money can concentrate power and wealth and lead to terrible unfairness. I think these dual magisteria of society and economics can kind of balance each other's worst failure modes. They can blunt each other's thorns to some degree. And this is a bit of a complex topic I won't go into right now, but I hope I treat it reasonably in the book. Now, what I'm thinking is that what we can hope for from digital technology is a way to not create a perfect society. I think any attempt at perfection always ends in tears. It's just, that's never going to work. But to add to this process of a balance of different systems so that none of them can go too badly. I think of the way America is balanced between a legislature and a judicial branch and an executive branch. And it's a very interesting idea where the hope is that each prevents the others from going off the deep end too much. And I think for the most part it kind of works. I think sometimes we wish they would work together more in a positive sense, but I think they blunt each other's tendencies to go entirely bad. And so I think we have to think that way about the societies for organizing our affairs that we know about, that economics and social processes are a little different because economics is more abstract and more numerical, and that these two systems can balance each other. Now I think computation is a third one, and maybe these three things can balance each other. And what I'm trying to do in the book is find that balance. Those people who have socialist tendencies or lefty tendencies sometimes think I'm trying to elevate capitalism and I think too much about money. I don't see it that way. Let me give you a specific example about how bringing money into the world of information might create balance instead of sort of extreme capitalist evil or something. One of the trends that's concerning me, and I think a lot of people, is the proliferation of cloud-connected cameras. So governments already benefit from having cameras on every corner in densely populated areas, and software, some of which came from my old startup that Google bought, it must be admitted, can track people by face or by gait or all kinds of things. And now all of a sudden you have this system where government can know where everybody is and what everybody's doing. And wars were fought precisely to keep governments from getting this power, but now we think it's just cute. We think it's cute that Silicon Valley companies with kindergarten names can do it. And that's problematic. That's really problematic. So how do you undo it? So the usual way you try to undo it is you have some sort of advocacy group like the Electronic Frontier Foundation or the ACLU or something like that, and they have lawyers that go in and argue with government officials and try to sway candidates to enact regulations. So here I'm looking at a bunch of clever programmers with huge computers and huge connectivity coming up with schemes, and then I'm looking at government bureaucrats trying to come up with prohibitions. And I just do not see a fair fight. And another example is regulators trying to control high-frequency traders. You know, it's the way high-frequency trading algorithms go. If you try to slow the frequency of them or put caps on them or something like that, the algorithms will just adapt and use that as part of the little system that they're optimizing against. So what can possibly be done? I don't think you can use a prohibition regime to get anywhere. Well, you can maybe have some effect, but I think it's very hard. If information costs money, then the picture changes. I don't think having it cost money is the complete solution, but it's part of it. So traditionally, one of the ways that the people constrains the government, or for that matter, other powers, churches and corporations, is that it costs money to do things, and the control of taxes creates a constraint. Do you remember no taxation without representation, that whole thing? So the police don't get to have free cars. The police can't just go to an auto lot and say, hey, I want some cars for my police department. I'll just send them over. Okay, fine. You know, you can't do that. Instead, they have to argue for taxes to pay for a budget, and then they have to go buy them like everybody else, and it creates a constraint. So if you have to pay money once you've recognized somebody on a camera, all of a sudden you can't just do it without restraint. You have to strategize and prioritize. And what it does is it instead of just an automatic gathering of information or to create a perfect scheme, it creates a much more honest situation in which you're using an amount of information to create a balanced scheme. Because that cost is real. Information is never free. Paying for it only reflects the reality of information, which is that it had to come from somewhere. There was work to do it. It always comes from people. Information is always people in disguise. That's a philosophical point that we can go into in questions if you're interested. But it creates at least a baseline that doesn't tend towards infinity, of infinite power concentration, because there's a cost that balances it. So I think that monetizing information to a degree is actually friendly to civil liberties. It's friendly to just creating balance in government. Now, there are huge questions about how to do it, gigantic questions, and I don't pretend to have all the answers. Let me just go over a couple of little topics about the prospects for information costing money instead of being free. One of the first questions is, does this exclude people from access to information? Because a lot of the rhetoric of free and open information is that, well, it means even the poor have access and it creates opportunity and all that. Now, I just have to point out that we've tried it and it's done exactly the opposite. The middle class is sinking, wealth and power are concentrating in smaller and smaller numbers. Every time you tweet a complaint about the 1%, you're enriching the 1%. You know, so, I mean, just, you have to understand the reality that the system is not working. It's having the opposite effect as what was intended. So, this is something that's interesting to me. If I look at how outcomes are sorted for people in some information systems, I see a winner-take-all system. If I look at the people who do well in an information network that's connected around a central hub, like a YouTube, or an Amazon or a Kickstarter or something where there's like this one gathering point and everybody has to cycle through it, what you get is a tall tower, an emaciated neck, and a long tail. You get tiny, tiny, tiny numbers of people who do well. That's cognitively problematic because people are primed to want to believe in hope. And so this, going back to the 19th century, this is what was called a Horatio Alger story. The idea that since there are a few people who legitimately do well in the system, a lot of other people who are still living with their parents and running on hope and self-funding are always within just a hair's breadth of that success, but they won't get it. And this really bugs me. I mean, there's a commonly held belief in this sort of illusion of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of musicians who are doing great because they can promote themselves online and they can sell their t-shirts and they can promote their gigs. And I've gone out and tried to count the musicians who are doing well in our system, and they're just handfuls. The numbers are tiny. It's tokenism. It's not real. I'm really struck that even the people at the top of the new regime, what's considered to be great success is kind of like what used to be considered just getting into the middle class. Like, how many people know who Jenna Marbles is? Okay, so she's had 1 billion hits on YouTube. She offers beauty and dating advice for young women. Not easy stuff to watch for me, I have to admit. But she's, on the other hand, she's sort of like a cross between Snooki and Martha Stewart, something like that. And so she's a giant of media, and then there are all these articles about how successful she is as being one of the top YouTube stars, maybe even the top one. And what she's able to do now is in her mid-20s, she can rent a $1.1 million house in LA. And, you know, if you talk to like an engineer at a Silicon Valley firm renting a $1.1 million house in LA, that's like this huge crown to it. I mean, I think it's great for somebody in their 20s that is doing well. I mean, that's a great luxury considering how many people are starving in the world or don't have access to clean water or something. So I don't want to minimize what that is. But on the other hand, if that's the very tippy top, think about where everybody else is. You know, it's not a lot. So we have this incredible lowering of expectations. But the thing is, for every Jenna Marbles, there's just 1 million people who are only that close. You know, all the people who have like 20,000 or 100,000 views on YouTube, and it's so close, and they get a few tantalizing things, they get a few gigs, or they get this or that, and they think, wow, I can almost make this work, but then they can't quite. And that society based on false hope is, I think, one of the cruelest sorts of societies in a way, emotionally. And I think, at some point, I don't know when it'll hit, but a lot of these people who are living on the fumes of hope now will start to have pretty rough midlife crisis when it just doesn't work out. And I think it's a shame. It's a tragedy waiting to happen for the Facebook generation. At some point, the Facebook generation, more likely their kids, are going to say, we're sick of this. We're sick of every financial scheme being a giant computer that's trying to radiate all the risk to us. We're sick of living on false hope. At some point, people will realize that the price they're paying is just too high. Now, I often hear this sort of terror about, oh my God, if I have to pay for information, you expect me to pay to look at somebody's stupid Facebook page? All right, so the thing is, you pay to go to stupid movies, and people pay to go to the Jackass movies or something. People pay for dumb stuff all the time. Titanic, gargantuan industries in an affluent society are based on wants instead of needs. Or this is what Abraham Maslow talked about, how this line shifts between wants and needs. So cosmetics, professional sports, I don't know. I mean, I hardly even know where to begin. A vast amount of our economy is based on taste and wants and very subjective values. And there's absolutely no reason why there couldn't be a society in which we do get paid for our social media life, and we pay for social media stuff other people do. And now you might say, well, what's the point of that? Isn't it just churn? And here's where there's a leap of faith required. Capitalism can work. Markets can work. Markets work when they start helping people coordinate to create more wealth and more positive effects for each other than they would have otherwise. And when you have a market that grows as a result of that, more people do better in a trading system than would have in a sharing system. And I think that's happened again and again, and it's a real effect. And it's entirely appropriate, especially for an information network. So yes, you'd be paying, but you'd also be getting paid. The nature of getting paid would be unlike any other form of payment that people have experienced in market economies before. We're used to the idea that you pay for stuff more often than you get paid. You only get paid every 2 weeks or something for your salary or whatever, royalty check or whatever it is, and then you're always buying your coffee and you're spending in little dribs and drabs. In this world, you would get paid in little dribs and drabs all the time. And different people would find different little systems in which they'd start getting paid. If you want to get a feeling for how much you ought to be paid that's being stolen from you now in information, you can start keeping track of all the so-called discounts you get when you allow somebody to spy on you. So look at your club card when you shop at the groceries and look at the differential between what you spend in a year. Look at the frequent flyer programs that you join and how much you'd have to spend if you didn't belong to them. And you can start to calculate that there's a fair amount of money that if it were real money instead of just a bargain, if you were in control of that money, you might be making decisions that would put you into participation as a first-class citizen in a market that would be growing instead of concentrating wealth. If you look at the information that people are interested in a thickly connected network that doesn't go through a central hub, a very interesting effect comes out, which is that instead of just a few superstars and the thin neck and the emaciated long tail that you see this very thickly connected thing where most people are of actually interest to a lot of people. This is work that's been done, funded sometimes by Facebook to try to protect itself from critics who are saying that it's actually just centralizing influence or something. It's very interesting research, but what it means is that if the stuff was monetized, we'd be seeing a middle-class hump out of something like Facebook. And this is intriguing because it's just possible that a monetized information network would yield a kind of a middle-class hump in a new way, instead of through all the little ratchet systems, which I call levies in the book, like the taxi medallions and cosmetology licenses and academic tenure and union membership and all these things. There might be a kind of a natural distribution of wealth that would create a thicker middle. Now, I have to say something about the middle class, because I've noticed that a lot of my hip friends, my oh-so-hip friends, and even a little part of me sort of are affronted by the term middle class because it means some kind of bourgeois, parent-oriented, horrible loss of hipness that is everything we must renounce is the middle class. And I'm talking about really a different thing, which is very simple, which is the issue of the aristocracy that so occupied the founders of the United States. The key thing is that you need to have a preponderance of people kind of in the middle of outcomes of human life who collectively have more influence than any elite tip. That's what you need. The middle has to be able to out-clout the tip. You need that if you want a democracy. If there's an elite that can outspend everybody else, democracy becomes a sham. I'm not happy with what's going on with money and politics in the U.S. lately. I don't know anybody who is. But furthermore, if you care about market dynamics, if you like capitalism, if you're a libertarian, you need exactly the same thing. You need the middle to be able to outspend the tip, because otherwise you don't have customers. Otherwise you end up with a petrostate or a plutocracy or with oligarchs or some sort of fake feudal system that's pretending to be a market but isn't. So that system where the middle is robust is absolutely essential to every humane system of organizing human affairs that's ever appeared. You can't count on some infinitely wise and charitable elite. And this brings up another point, which is I happen to think that the Silicon Valley elite might be one of the nicest ones to have ever appeared in history. I think we're sweet. But the thing is that we can't let that enter into our thinking. You don't have to try to imagine that the captains of Silicon Valley industry, however young and cute they are sort of villains or evil, because they're not for the most part. I still think Sergey's great, you know. I still think that I think we're cute. I think we're great. The problem is that over time you don't know who will inherit the power. And Exhibit A sadly is HP, which was the company that started the pattern for all of us and has degraded. I'm sorry if there are HP people here. Both, I'm sorry for saying this and also my condolences. But, what a tawdry thing. But this is normal. This will happen to every human institution. This is how time proceeds. Things go through periods of decadence. They go through periods of corruption. We have to plan a society with that kind of realism that there won't ever be some eternally benevolent, pure, and intelligent elite. Every elite is subject to degradation over time. I'm attempting a little stunt broadly in the book, which is very experimental, which is I'm making myself vulnerable in order to get a point across. I could have stopped the book halfway through with the scathing critique of how power is being concentrated around big computers, and then I could have stopped. And then I think a lot of cool people would say, wow, what a cool book. It talks about power in a new way. And I think it would get adopted in a lot of cool courses and humanities departments and whatnot. And it would be, a lot of French scholars would like it, whatever. It would have this kind of cachet, but I do something that totally undoes that, which is I try to talk about solutions, even though I know for certain that my first pass at solutions can't possibly be right, even though I know that I'm going to read this stuff myself in 10 years and think, wow, I was naive. That was, God, how did I make that mistake? But I lay my neck out before you because I think it's essential that we have the courage to be imperfect in our attempts to improve ourselves. And I want to be first in line in taking on that vulnerability. I think almost all of my friends who are very technical and run the biggest computers in the world and program them are people of very good will who are open to these ideas. I've found extraordinary warmth from everybody in Silicon Valley who I've talked to about this stuff, and even in the centers of finance, electoral politics, and the spy masters I know, and all these worlds of big computation. I think one of the good things about this moment is that this is one of the more pleasant elites in history and is open-minded, and I think we have an excellent shot at fixing this. And the final thing I'll say is that humanity, to speak in the biggest terms, we're at the point now where we're inventing our own fate. We're not beholden to nature so much anymore. We change our own climate. We screw ourselves over more than any other creature or any other effect screws us over. We're in charge of ourselves, and the only way we can see what we're doing to ourselves is with the same big data I've been talking about. And so you might say, well, wouldn't it be better for the data to be free? Well, it would be even better if our use of the data wasn't corrupted by the powers of free data combined with big computers. So what we've seen now is an almost perfect inability to separate the truths that we can discern from big data from the corruptions of big data. Climate science, the people who first discerned global climate change and big data were subjected to WikiLeaks-like dynamic. You know, their emails were leaked, and then conspiracy theorists poured over them. Meanwhile, the people who put out the economic theories in support of austerity measures in response to the financial scandals, they based their stuff on bad programming, and it took a long time to get this stuff revealed so you could see it. So we have not established a way to use big data with credibility so that people can really hear its method. We have not connected the idea of big data with truth yet. And as long as we're living our lives with these schemes that are intended to concentrate money and power through perfect investments, through these perfect schemes, through these demonic attempts to make everybody else take the risk and to concentrate the benefit. As long as we're living with that, we're used to the idea of data being kind of nonsense. I was almost going to use a bad word, but then I remembered I'm on TV. So for instance, we are happy with big data algorithms to recommend music for us. We listen to music without even knowing who made it, just these streams. We date people who are recommended by these algorithms, perhaps the most intimate decision we ever make. We do all this even though every time real science is applied, we discover these algorithms don't work. The algorithms that are supposed to find you the perfect date are not scientifically valid. They might work because people who want to meet people are on these things. I mean, they have an organizationally contingent kind of validity, but the algorithms themselves are nonsense. And in the back of our mind, we know that it's all a big game, that it's all a big confidence game. What I'm hoping, my deepest hope, is that if information cost money, you'd have to use it more carefully, and it might give rise to businesses and a culture of the use of information that took it a bit more seriously, and that might give rise to a culture that becomes able to discern truth from nonsense in big data. And if we can't get there, our survival is threatened. So I view this as being connected to the bigger picture of how we can make ourselves less insane in order to make it through this crazy century that's ahead. So with that, I thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to take some questions.
So for the Q&A, it would be great if you guys can come up to the mic, because as we said, C-SPAN is recording.
Hello.
Hey.
Thank you for coming tonight. I have a question. You discuss rewarding people for putting bits of information into the system as a way to make the middle class more robust. How does the creation of this informal economies and collaborative consumption fit into this model? For example, instead of monetizing information that we put into the system, but monetizing our assets, like renting out our homes on Airbnb, renting our bicycles, our power tools, etc., to have like a second income. Does this contribute to your idea of making the middle class more robust, or do you uniquely mean for information?
Okay, so yeah, I talk about Airbnb and similar things in the book. So, in general, the informal economy is not a good thing. People in the ghettos of the world are desperately trying to get out of informal economies and into formal ones. Informal economies are great if you will be young forever, will never get sick, will always have parents to support you. In other words, if you're not human. There's this sort of illusion that people are like these little information nodes, and if wealth is the opposite of an informal economy. Wealth means that I'm sure there are engineers in the audience. It means personal hysteresis. It means that you have some staying power of your own. So in the case of something like Airbnb or the many other schemes, the schemes that are sending people around to pretend to be taxi drivers for each other or whatever, the thing that you'll notice again and again is that the people running the big computers at the center of these schemes avoid all risk. They say, oh, we're at arm's length. We have nothing to do with it. All of you take the risk. Now, the problem with that is it's Maxwell's demon all over again. Risk and waste heat are kind of are related in this in physics, actually. So what's happening is by trying to create this perfect system that always wins no matter what happens on the ground, the people who are in the informal economy have to take the risk themselves. And so you can rent out your place 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, nobody rips you off, and then something happens. But there was no insurance scheme, and there was no risk pool of people. There was no planning for it. So very gradually, because of the contingencies of life, the contingencies that always come up, if you're participating in these informal schemes, sooner or later you'll get bitten. Something will happen. You'll be sick on the day somebody needed your apartment or something will happen. And so as long as you always have perfect luck, the informal economy is great. But what needs to happen is we need to get away from this idea of a central hub that takes no risk at all, just organizing people and then everybody taking risk with no planning to manage that risk. And there are various ways that can happen. My concern is that when people say, oh, I'll create an insurance service for people who rent out their apartments or give each other rides over the net, those insurance things then again become another example of a big computer that's trying to take no risk. I mean, the same pattern just reappears again and again. And the generalized way out of it is to have the information itself be monetized so that, which is what insurance schemes are. Insurance schemes basically monetize information in order to create risk pools to manage risk. And so if you can't make the leap to that kind of sophistication, then everybody is forced into insecurity, because that's what informal economies are. Okay, back. Yes, next, please.
To make this very short, first I've been thinking a lot about a lot of these issues, and I want to thank you for making a brilliant presentation in such a short time. So my concern is that in addition to technology, which is what you've been voicing, there's also the specter of education and personal health. And what I mean is that if you have a population that is not educated since grade 1, we all know that the problem in this country is elementary education, which is dismal, and then the problem of personal health and the food that we eat, the fact that laws have been passed that make the world's biggest genetic seed manipulator not suable anymore, things like that. So if you have a population that is not really that well educated and is not really that healthy, how then can that population think for itself and wean itself away from using things like YouTube or Twitter or Facebook for purely entertainment purposes? You see what I mean? That's on one side. And on the other side, I think you need to bring in the people like the heads of Google and Facebook and all of these people, get them over to your kind of thinking, because without that, I think they're not going to see the fallacy of what, like you just said, they're just not going to see through their own actions. So my question, I guess, is how do we start to individually here in this room and with our families, how do we take those baby steps?
Yeah, well, I have a lot of friends who are writers, and around Berkeley there are a lot of people like Michael Pollan and all sorts of people like that who write about big issues but also give you things you can do. Like in the issue of food, you can grow your food, you can cook and buy things intelligently and all this stuff. And part of me wants to do that with these things, and I haven't found a good way to do it, honestly. If I do, I'll write a book about that. The reason I haven't is that a lot of the things I can suggest just feed into the problem. It's very hard to do bottom-up stuff to address this, because bottom-up stuff precisely feeds the monster that I'm concerned about. You know, like I was saying before, every time you tweet about the 1%, you're enriching the 1%, and you run into this kind of conundrum. And I'm working on this problem of like what you can do. Now, of course, if you're highly technical, it's a different story. Then you can do all kinds of stuff. Like if you know how to program, then you can operate your Facebook privacy settings, right? And if you you can probably use all kinds of tools. You can use your VPN, and you can, blah, 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 all this stuff. But the thing is that just as with, if you want to change the food system, just having your cool local organic market where things cost 10 times more than any poor person can afford doesn't really solve the big problem. In the same way, problems that only technical people, strategies that only technical people can take advantage of doesn't really address anything. So I'm actually stuck at that point. I'd like to solve it. I get proposals every single day, many of them from people who have ideas about this, and I'm interested. So far, I have to just tell you honestly, I don't know how to answer your question. I want to know. Okay.
Glad to see that you mentioned Jenna Marbles.
You look like a Jenna Marbles fan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And the reason I mention this is because in a U.S. history class I teach, I noted how you go back to Jefferson and the birth of America and the notion of the yeoman farmer. If everybody has a chance to get some land, they can become independent. They can be their own boss. So self-sturdy, independent, you're on your own land, you can grow your own food, you can have a great family. And I pose to the class, is this going to be possible with the internet? Can we have millions of Jenna Marbles? And what I like so much about your work is you're sort of posing the question, can the internet, if you will, be a sort of virgin land, quote unquote, that America was supposed to be when the first Europeans arrived and wanted to slice and dice it up so each person can have their own little plot. And of course, it's highly problematic as to whether the internet can become that, though I like your idea very much that everybody should sort of buy and sell just by clicking on the internet. But as I say, well, what do you think of that vision of the yeoman farmer, Jeffersonian democracy?
Oh my God, there's so much to say about this. I mean, let me try to, it brings up so many points. First, the original design for networking was monetized. This is Ted Nelson's work starting in 1960, from before we knew how to make networks. This is from before packet switching was invented. The original idea for networking included much of what I'm talking about, and it was lost gradually in a series of tawdry incidents that I describe in the book, which I probably won't go into right now, but we actually were there. And the reason that happened was precisely because of this tradition in America. And yet, I grew up in the West. I grew up in an obscure part of southern New Mexico in a place where the roads were still dirt and people wandered around with horses and rifles, and it was just the tail end of the Old West. And I can tell you, there's a lot that's not great about a world of people who are self-made, and because it does favor the strong. It does create a kind of a world of clans and mobs and gunslingers and stuff, and it's not necessarily a pretty world. What happened in America in general, in the American West in particular, was the land was free, except we pretended the Native Americans hadn't been there. To get to your land, you had to go through somebody's monopolized railroad or some transportation system. And, gradually we lost that romance and entered into this world of monetized land instead of free land and real estate and all these, real estate agents with their little signs and everything. And that world is a little less romantic and a little more nerdy or something, but it's safer and more fair and better, and it creates more wealth and coordination for people, and I think it's a better world overall. And in a sense, that transformation, as much as I like the romance of the birth of America, the truth is that the transformation to the America we know is probably not a bad precedent, not a bad model for what ought to happen to the world of information, which might lose a touch of romance but become better for most people.
Well, can we get a New Deal?
Well, okay, so there's some other people, and I don't want to. I think we get if we're willing to have a world war, then we get a New Deal. I'd rather not go there. Yeah.
I agree that a bottoms-up solution to changing things to monetize information seems very, very difficult. And so, have you given any thought to meeting of minds of people who own big computers? And have you given thought to how big a prototype would have to be in order to make it meaningful? And I have one more little question. Could that possibly end up being also stratified between people who produce quality information and people who consume, kittens running into walls, videos and things like that?
Okay. So two questions there. In the book, I fantasized that the 1,000 top hackers in the world get together and create a new system, and then invent a tattoo robot once we're confident we won't put tattoo artists out of work. Just to some sort of weird event, and like the kind of thing that happens at the Googleplex over a weekend or something. And sure. I mean, I propose a few different routes to where we could have a transformation, but it is a phase change. I'm not pretending it would be easy. There might have to be. I mean, although I have to say, how much financial suffering does it take until people realize that the current financial regime is completely not working? How many times do we have to go through this? We did it with savings and loans, and we did it with bundled securities and with mortgages, and now we're going to do it with student debt, and we're doing it with sovereign debt. We're, again and again and again, and how many times does this have to happen? And so it's sort of like the old Dylan song or something. How many times must a big computer fail before we call it crap? I mean, at what point? I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how long it takes until we realize that this pattern isn't sustainable. And then your other question is, I get this a lot. Aren't there just a few people who make all the good information and everybody else doesn't? I don't see empirically, if I look at what people are interested in online, they're interested in each other in a very general way. There is a kind of a middle-class distribution where a preponderance of people get a medium amount of attention instead of everybody getting all the attention. The number of it doesn't happen in a spoken hub network like YouTube, but it does happen in a thickly connected graph like Facebook. So I'm not convinced of that. I think we should give each other some more credit until proven otherwise. I'm going to remain optimistic that most people provide value in an advanced world. I mean, if it's really true that in an advanced world, everybody's really dull and useless except for the 3 people who programmed the thing, I don't know, there's a lot of science fiction like that. That's one of the central ideas in science fiction. That's one of the recurring themes. I don't see the evidence. I'm actually more optimistic about people. And I don't think that makes me naive. I think I'm just trying to be realistic, and I think we're actually overall more interesting and valuable than we give ourselves credit for. Okay, next.
It's a perfect lead-in into my question. By the way, thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm one of the open source people, so I enjoyed the. But I want to look at it at what you're discussing from a different level of abstraction. So I think you're talking about the 21st century. If I were to characterize the 21st century, I think the main achievement of the century, the main understanding, is the equalization of information and matter. So information and matter is one of the same, and I think the impending revolution of 3D printing will prove that to be the case. So if you think about it this way, then when you talk about putting a value on information, it's a same thing as putting property tax, right? So you own things, you pay property tax. And
no, it's not.
No?
No. So the way it would work with 3D, I go into 3D printers quite a lot. So let's say 3D printing really hits big, and I kind of hope it does because I think it's just cool, right? And so every day you have a new outfit because it's made perfectly for your body. You never do laundry. It's all recycled material. Every gig you get a new guitar design. All those designs have to come from somewhere. It's not so much the ownership of the objects, it's do people get paid for the designs. And so the key thing here is that, look, I have friends who have great careers, have done very well for themselves being cool hunters. New York City is filled with them, LA too. And what they do is they go to poor neighborhoods and they watch what poor kids are wearing, and then they translate that into expensive fashions. There's an incredibly broad base of people who would come up with designs. So our existing terminology is a little awkward for this. It's maybe a bit more like a service thing or a design, but it's not so much owning the object, because the objects, the more 3D printers work, or the better automated fabrication works, the less ownership means. But that's a totally different question. That's a sideshow. The key thing is, do the people who really contribute the value, are they remembered, and are they treated as being real, or do we come up with an illusion to pretend they weren't there?
So, let me try to ask a question. So, when I'm equating information, by the way, I don't mean design, I don't mean the object, because object becomes just a copy, right?
Sure, yeah.
So, when matter and information is one and the same thing, then whoever is able to process the sufficient amount of information will become the most meaningful producer of wealth over time. And I think that what you're trying to address is a tactical problem, because it's only a matter of a few tens of years until machines will do it better than humans. It's just
No. Machines don't do anything. Machines don't exist. It's only people pretending that other people don't exist. You just made a huge logical error. Right. You were doing great there for a while.
And I'm curious.
You just fell off a cliff, though.
I mean, this I think is. There's a number of futurists who don't think that, and that clearly this is. And my question is exactly that. Why? I mean, because there's a whole train of thought that actually doesn't think the way you think. And
I know. Hey, of course I know that. No, look, a lot of it. People are a little crazy and very emotional. So open source, I was present in the room when open source was born, because Richard Stallman and I were friends, and I remember him being so upset about the software for the Lisp machine being held up because of a little company going bankrupt and all these things. And I understand the emotion of it. I understand that my buddy Ray Kurzweil doesn't want to die. I understand that it's nicer to think about a pristine, perfect digital immortality. I understand those emotions, and we can't run our society entirely on our passions and on our fears and on our terrors. And that's what technical culture is succumbing to. Now, let me address open source. There's a really interesting alternative to open source, because right now there's sort of two domains. There's the proprietary software domain, where you have these ridiculous licenses. I lampoon EULA's quite a bit in the book because it's a ridiculous regime, and everybody knows it's ridiculous. And then you have this open source thing, where you pretend that people don't exist, and you have like this sort of monster wiki creature that you pretend is the smart electronic brain that's actually just lowering everybody except for whoever runs the biggest computer. All right, there's a third alternative, which is interesting, which is every time code runs, little micropayments go back to whoever wrote the routine, and now that has never been given a fair chance. And I like that, because there's something, if you look at how code is built up, tons of people contribute to it. Like if you look at the Linux stack in a server, how many people contributed to that? So if there were little micropayments going out, that is a middle class distribution. That's one of these things I'm talking about. That's a middle class right there. That's a bulwark against elite tips that are currently forming around the use of those very machines, where they didn't have to pay for the software, right? I mean, this notion that you make open source, you put all this information out there, but then what you support is these gigantic Google concentrations of wealth and power. I mean, the whole thing is absurd. It's a failed idealism. And we have to try this other alternative. And if it worked that way, then Sergey and Larry would have made money from the search code, and they wouldn't have had to start the spying empire, right? Because that wouldn't have even been profitable, because they would have had to pay for the data. I mean, right now, the internet is multiplied a huge number of times to support things like BitTorrent that are just making needless copies of files to avoid paying for them. And that's a sin when you look at the carbon footprint of the internet. And you know, the greatest rewards are for the worst code and the worst use of machines. You know, and that's precisely what we're doing under the current regime. Anyway, yeah.
I totally believe in and am chilled by your analysis of the big picture. I've come to a lot of the same conclusions myself. But fair disclosure, I work for the evil empire in some sense. I've been a chief algorithm.
I just forget who's the evil empire, because I'm in Microsoft research, and it always totally confuses me. I'm really going through identity. Are you Google or is it Facebook now?
No, not one of the big evil empires, just sort of the community of evil empire.
Okay.
I've been a chief algorithm officer to a bunch of online ad companies.
Okay.
And so I'm a quant, I get the math. That's why I'm worried about it.
Okay,
what
cool.
speaks to me most about your thesis is ultimately in solving the problem, whatever the problem actually is the question of sort of truth versus money. There is the truth about how things work, and then there is the version of the truth that the powers that be find it short-term profitable to have people believe collectively, not every given individual may not. And the problem is that getting and promulgating the truth isn't quite so easy. In that case, information isn't really free at all. You've got to pay the computers and the programmers and the data analysis and the writers, got to pay to broadcast it. The data aggregation itself is in the servers of Google and Walmart and not on my PC. So just getting it all in one place is a lot. Broadcasting it is all ad supported. So somebody needs to be profiting at every single point in talking about this and getting the word out. My guess is if this kind of world-changing message were in support of Apple and Google, you'd be filling a stadium, not having 100 people. So broadly speaking, there's a huge bias in the information business getting the word out, a bias in favor of power and a bias against the kind of message you're trying to spread. So how can you overcome that?
Well, for what it's worth, I think I'm outselling Eric Schmidt. The other thing is, the answers, the what to do instead is always the hard part, and I don't want to overreach. I think we have a bit of time. My feeling about the time we have to fix this is we have to fix it before automation gets really good, like before all the cars drive themselves and everything's 3D printed and all that stuff, because that's when you see the massive unemployment. So we have to fix it, but not next week. We have a little bit of time, so I get fairly specific in the book, but I also leave some big questions open. I've been finding a wonderful reception. I'm going to go give this talk in the Googleplex in a bit, and I've talked to my Facebook friends about it. I'm not on Facebook. I mean the people who run Facebook who are my friends, and I don't have Facebook friends in the vernacular sense. Oh, but this is another thing. There's such a confidence game. People are run on fear so much that you have to keep on feeding the monster of these information systems. So I just, as an experiment, I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on Twitter, I don't do frequent flyers, I don't do any of this. I just don't sign up for all these things. I seem to be doing okay. Everything seems to be fine. So in a sense, it might not be all that important. But anyway, but to answer your question, I'm finding a lot of goodwill and good reception, and I think I'm pretty happy with how it's going. I mean, the book's only been out for a week in the States. It's been out a little longer in the UK, but I think it's going well. I'm happy.
So even if the mass communication system is rather heartless and profit-driven, you've made personal contacts with people who matter, and you're getting personal response.
I knew them from when they were zygotes, it's not like...
I hope it works.
Hey.
Hi. Well, this is off in a little bit different direction maybe, but as far as the future of technology, do you see us becoming ever more dependent on technology as we go forward? Kind of a la Ray Kurzweil, or is there at some point where we may...
Technology doesn't exist. Look, I don't know how to... Okay, look, let's say you give me a computer, all right? And then I'm going to ask you to find me one other thought experiment creature, which is some Martian that knows nothing about human culture. That Martian looks at the computer and they can't tell whether it's a lava lamp or not. All it is something making patterns and radiating heat. Without culture, technology doesn't exist. You have to know how to use it. You have to know what it means. It's not a freestanding thing. So to the degree we're dependent on technology, we're just pretending that each other don't matter. It's saying the same thing. So it's a trick of thought. It's a piece of stage magic. It's phony.
totally get that, but it sounds good.
Okay, let me try. I mean, I don't know how. The example of the translators, did that help? I don't know. Anyway, okay.
Hi, it's been a 20-year gap since I've last seen you. I saw you at UCSC when you were with VPL. I was much younger.
That was more than 20 years ago, my friend.
Was it more than 20 years ago?
Let me tell you, I on my 40th birthday, I happened to be giving a lecture at the CS department at Stanford, and there was a Stanford freshman sitting there in the first row, and he looked at me when I came in to give my seminar, and he said, "Jaron Lanier, you're still alive?" and that was 13 years ago. So yeah.
Older than that. So I'll give you the one question.
Okay.
Which is, can you speak to the two different human qualities? You've kind of touched on these: hubris and humility, and the role that they may play in the vision that you have for the future, and how we can all kind of participate in creating that future.
Well, hubris is interesting because I sort of feel like when Silicon Valley tries to be arrogant, we can't quite pull it off because fundamentally we are kind of sweet nerds. But then when we don't think we're being arrogant is when we are, you know. And so that's the funniest thing. I mean, like when you hang out with Wall Street people, boy, then you see what arrogance really looks like, or politicians or something. It's different. Like we tend to just recent when I don't know if there was this recent thing of a political action committee that Silicon Valley companies tried to start, and it just kind of flubbed itself up because it doesn't know how to be a mean bully. Like it doesn't even make sense, you know. Like we're not. So there's a kind of a sweetness to our culture, but I think humility is not just a lack of bullying. It actually requires just the hard work of trying to see oneself clearly, and it's a constant process that you never quite get to fully. And I don't know how good I've gotten at it. I'm at least trying. I don't know, you know. So, but I think it's an ongoing process.
My name's Tim Millard, and the question I have for you is: I'm a parent of 3 kids. I don't know if you're a parent. Are you a parent?
I am a parent.
You are. And so my question for you is: my kids are kind of geeky kids. They're always looking around. We live in Palo Alto, and they're trying to figure out what's going on in the world and what they want to do. Mm-hmm. And just I'm wondering, as a parent, you know, what are your thoughts or advice? You know, I'm trying to teach my children to be good, loving people who are well educated. Do you have any advice on what kids are studying, and besides being good people involved in the community, what do you think they should be doing to prepare for the stuff that you're describing?
I don't know. Look, my qualifications as a parent will become known to me when my daughter's an adult, which will not be for a while. I can say a couple things. I'm a little worried about how structured our kids' lives are these days, where they go from play date to play date and everything is planned. And in a way, I think the structure of Facebook is sort of the extension of the play date from when you're a little kid. Because, you know, in the 90s, when I would talk to teenagers in high schools or undergraduates or something, and I'd say, how many of you have websites? They'd say, oh yeah, I made my website and everything. And now you ask, and it's like nobody. Everybody goes into this pre-structured thing where they're following a groove that's laid out for them, which is less work, but it's sort of odd for me. This also goes back to the Jeffersonian question from before, that everybody goes into this pre-structured kit-like life. And I'm a little worried that, I mean, like, I love the way we can teach science with these little kits where you can make your own robot, or pretty soon, actually it's already true, you can make your own organism in BioClass or something. But the problem is that there's a sort of kit quality where everything's pre-structured and you don't hit raw reality. You don't hit the mystery of this place we're in directly so much, because everything is so organized and so structured. And I worry about that. I think that that's not good for being a person or being a scientist, and I'm totally part of the problem. I'm not going to tell my daughter, oh yeah, go play in the street, you know, because I see these jerks driving around. It's not going to happen, you know. But in a sense, I'm denying her something, you know, and I don't know how to resolve that. It really bothers me. And the other thing I want to say is that one of the rings of hell is filled with elementary school math teachers. I cannot believe how incredibly crappy the curriculum is. Like when my daughter was in kindergarten, she's in first grade now. I went to pick her up one time, and all the little girls the girls arguing about, if I may say so, kind of stupid social crap that I mean, it's true, like, oh, so-and-so like so-and-so, like, but anyway, I'm sure I just betrayed some kind of male blindness or something. But anyway, but this time I came and they were all arguing about whether infinity was a number or a weird idea. And they were making excellent arguments. They were really thinking about it. So I went to their math teacher and said, my God, all the little girls are arguing about whether infinity is a number. We've got to do something with this. It's like, nah, addition is where it's at. And that, to me, this blows my mind. It blows my mind that the natural curiosity of children around ideas in math isn't something that we seize upon. And I don't know what to do about it. But one of the things I talk about in the book is that the No Child Left Behind testing regime is yet another one of these things where somebody's concentrating influence through a big computer. And every time you see this, you see a rise of phoniness where the test doesn't really measure anything important. You also see a rise of cheating where the information becomes suspect. All the same things we see in the dating sites and in the finance sites and everything else where information becomes unreliable even as it concentrates power. We're seeing in education now. And so the same corrupting influence is happening there, and it really bugs me. Yep.
Hey, Jaron. I know it's been 25 years since my company and Marianne worked with your company trying to produce a virtual reality game console using your VPL glasses and Tom Zimmerman's glove and.
Right. Well, is Tom here? Did Tom come? Yeah, Tom was at VPL, of course, and I think he's an IBM research fellow now or something like that. Yeah.
Well, I recently attended the Game Developers Conference, and I was surprised to see that the Oculus Rift now is the big news there because instead of using the $10,000 Polimas device to determine positions of that equipment, they got the 25-cent chip that's in all of our smartphones now. Yeah. Where do you see this? Is this a resurgence now? Is virtual reality coming back?
Well, I don't know. I've been around this thing for a while, and virtual reality it gets big again every 3 years or so. There's like this wave, and I hope the Oculus Rift people do great. I think it's really cool. I mean, obviously, it brings back memories of when I was a kid trying to do this stuff, and it is cool that it's not so expensive these days. And I hope they do wonderfully.
What do you think about the augmented reality like the Google Glass?
Google Glass. A bunch of my buddies at Google work on it, and I think it's a cool little device. I mean, the problem is not the glass; it's the business plan that Google is stuck with that makes it creepy. Oh, somebody asked before. Am I saying things that are against the interest of the Apples and the Googles and the Facebooks and all these people and the Amazons? And I'm absolutely convinced that what I'm saying is in all of our interests, including the people who are running the big computers now, because ultimately we're undermining our own source of wealth. I mean, it's a short-term gain versus a long-term gain. And so right now, like when Kodak, as I say in the book, it employed 140,000 people with good middle-class jobs. Instagram had 13 people, one of whom could be here. One of them was at one of my talks a while ago. 13 people, worth $1 billion. I don't mind success. I love people being really successful. I have tons of friends who are really successful, and I applaud that. But we should create our success through growing the economy, not through shrinking it. And right now, we're concentrating money in order to create our success through shrinking the economy, which will ultimately come and bite us, as it always does when you use a big computer to make a perfect scheme. So I'm convinced that in this world, Facebook and Apple and Google and all the rest would actually do better than they're doing because they'd be part of a growing economy instead of one that's being squozen down into a little perfect scheme. So I am absolutely on the side of the winners of Silicon Valley. I think any scheme should be. I mean, I applaud success. I want to see more of it. All right, thanks for coming.